Okay, for this activity, we're going to talk about something that is really special to me in my life and experience that I've had, and we're going to tie in everything that we've learned about gene expression and things so far to review. So we're going to talk about spinal muscular atrophy. It's a genetic disease. How I know about this, that's a really old picture of me. So I used to teach adjunct at a community college, and Wendy here on the right, where's my mouse? Wendy was one of my students. So she was a returning student coming back to get a degree. And this is her daughter, Stephanie. And Wendy one day came to me. Stephanie had just had their first baby. It was her first grandbaby. And she said, and the baby was like, I don't know, maybe 4 months old, 5 months old. And she said that they think there's something wrong with the baby. He doesn't have enough muscle tone. He's having a hard time. And I said, oh, that's interesting. What are they thinking? And she says, I don't know. They took blood and they said they're checking for SMA. But I don't know what that is. And I said, they didn't tell you anything? And she said, no. And so I went home and researched it. Well, SMA is fatal. It's a horrible genetic disease. So I came back to her the next day and I said, are you sure that's what they said? And she said, yeah. And then eventually the test results came back, and sure enough, their child had SMA. And so this is actually Alexander Ross, their first baby. And he lived 11 months. So what happens is their motor neurons start to degenerate and they can't breathe. So it's called floppy baby syndrome. They can't lift their heads. They can't hold themselves up, but they grow and everything else is normal. It's really, really tragic. And so he died at 11 months old. And it turns out that they went ahead and had another baby. And this is Samuel Alexander. That's who was in the picture with us. So Samuel Alexander is alive and well, normal baby. And then they took their chances and they had a third, and this is Savannah Grace, and she died at 11 months as well of the same disease, which was really awful. She was born 2 weeks before my youngest, so she would have been 7 now. Anyway, so really, really tragic and a really hard disease. So we're gonna look at it very closely and see if we can figure out what's going on. So first of all, how can 2 normal parents with no symptoms of the disease have 2 kids die of the same genetic disease? So I just want you to pause the video and think about that for just a second. Likely this is pretty easy for you, right? That if it's 2 parents, they must both be heterozygous for a recessive disease, and that is indeed the case. They're both heterozygous, both Stephanie and her husband. They didn't know, but they were both heterozygous for the same recessive disease. And so what are the chances that they have a child with SMA? Well, if you've got 2 heterozygotes, it's 25%. But just because they first had it, does that mean that they get to have 3 normal kids before they'll have it again? Well, no, and that's a common misconception with people, is that if it's only 25%, then only 1 of my 4 kids, I get to have 3 healthy if I have 1 sick. But it's 25% every time. And so they were unlucky in getting 2 that had the disease. And so this is what's going on. It's very interesting. I mean, in a sad way, it's an interesting genetic story. So everybody in here, everybody watching this, you all have at least 1 duplicate copy of the gene involved. So the gene is called SMN1. It stands for survival motor neuron 1. You don't need to know that, but that's the gene. Okay, and it's got a very, very important responsibility that we'll talk about later. But in SMN, everybody has SMN1, and then everybody has at least 1 duplicate of that gene that's called SMN2. Because it's a duplicate, it probably duplicated, millions of years ago in our evolutionary history. And because it's a duplicate, it's free to mutate and it doesn't hurt people. And so the SMN2 gene actually has a mutation in it that we're going to look at. But because you have SMN1, you're fine. You don't even know that you have a mutation in SMN2. Some people have 3, 4, 8 copies of SMN2. Just depends on what you inherited from your parents. And so anyway, so if you have SMN1 like Samuel, you're fine, the mutation doesn't bother you. But Alexander has a mutation in SMN1 that wipes out its function. And so they have to rely on SMN2 for all the function that it has to do, and it doesn't function very well because of this mutation. And so we're going to look at that. All right, but before we do, I want you to answer these questions, and I'm actually going to stop the video here, and you're going to answer these questions, and then we'll talk about it.